So today we're going to start our series where we talk about survival weapons. People wanted to know about survival weapons and guns and some of my thoughts and ideas on them. So what we'll do is start with the crossbow. And this is a bayonet crossbow from the 1970s. What happened was there was a resurgence in interest in crossbows in the 1970s. The first ones were like the Whammo Power Master. That one had an aluminum bow on it, and eventually some of the issues with it led to the bankruptcy of Whammo, the toy company. That crossbow had a roughly 80-pound pull. There were others that were designed for hunting. Most of these were in the 80-pound range. Then what happened is Barnett got involved in the early 70s with the resurgence of crossbows in both the UK and America. This is an early 70s Wildcat crossbow. It's composed of all wood. The limbs on it are 150 pounds. And this is really what got the crossbow moving in the hunting and the survival field in the 70s and 80s. Now, in another video, I'll take you through the evolution of the Barnett crossbows and also their Taiwanese and Chinese copies. Now, when I started out, I couldn't afford a Barnett crossbow or any of the other stuff I used to see in American Survival Guide. I bought this one used many years ago and I fired quite a bit of rounds through it. What I want to do is talk about its usage in SHTF, the cost and logistics of it, and these are the things that all of the salesmen on YouTube leave out of the situation. Now, the cost in crossbows are the arrows, not the crossbow itself. People forever complain about a round of .308 costing $2, but they're more than happy to pay between $4 for a cheap arrow all the way up to $40 for an expensive arrow. And the big myth is that arrows are reusable. And where that myth comes from is there are three main uses for crossbows in archery. So when we talk about bows and we talk about crossbows, we're talking about weapons of serious weight for hunting and survival use. Now, the uses for them are recreation, and in that is included competition. So you have a full range of price there from casual use all the way up to expensive Olympic level competition. The next area of usage is hunting. Hunting crossbows usually are very expensive, the arrows are very expensive, and the broadheads are very expensive. And the people that own them usually do not have many arrows. The third use is combat archery. And I'm going to differ from what everybody on YouTube says combat archery is. What combat archery is the use of crossbows, bow and arrows, compound bows, compound crossbows in combat during SHTF. Now, there is a lot of downside to using a crossbow in combat. The slow reloading speed and the limited range. So right off the bat, we're going to make everybody unhappy, and we're going to say that the average person, the actual range to point targets for a crossbow is 20 to 40 yards. So in the hands of some people, it's up to 20 yards. In a practice person's hands, it's up to 40 yards. There are exceptions for people that do a lot of shooting in practice and really learn their crossbow, and some of these people can take it to 60 yards. Now, we're talking about engaging point targets, which are individual animals or individual people. And the problem is crossbow bolts are slow compared to firearms, and they drop really fast. That's what really limits their employed range. In hunting, the sound of the crossbow A lot of times an animal can hear that, and it ranges past 30 yards, they can jump before the arrow gets to them. So let's take a close look at this crossbow, and let's look at the economics of it. Now here we have the crossbow string, and for Barnett crossbows, the Taiwanese and Chinese copies, a crossbow string usually runs $25 to $40 depending on the manufacturer. The key here is the serving, which is the wound part here, that's wound around the main string. And what happens is on these crossbows, the older ones where the string's in contact with the bow itself, you have to wax the deck here. You have to wax the string and serving here. Now, one of your limitations on a crossbow, depending on the poundage, you may get 10 shots before you wear out your serving. If it's really well waxed and maintained, you may get 50 rounds. And then what'll happen is most people that do a lot of shooting, they will rewrap this serving, and that gives you much more longevity on the main string itself. So a lot of times you can wrap this serving several times before you actually wear the string out. So when we're thinking about this, we can say that a string will last most people about 100 shots. And then we look at the bow portion. And in crossbows, this is called a limb or a prod, depending on the vocabulary of the country you're in. Now, these can last anywhere from 500 to 2,000 shots before they start delaminating and cracking. Depends on the quality control, the country of origin, the model of your crossbow, and the poundage. So when we're thinking in terms of this, being able to buy a replacement prod is critical. The Chinese and Taiwanese basically copied the dimensions of the Barnett crossbow, and I have seen a lot of Barnett crossbows utilizing Taiwanese prods and strings. So you can actually buy enough of these to stay in business for quite a while. Now, this costs about $40 on Amazon or eBay to replace a prod. I haven't seen any real Barnett ones from the Barnett factory for these older crossbows for many, many years. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is the evolution of arrows. These older Barnetts use a 14-inch arrow, and this is an actual original Barnett crossbow bolt, and it was manufactured probably 40 years ago. And this is another Barnett crossbow bolt, and you can see how the fletching becomes brittle and breaks over time or gets ripped. So when we're looking at the Taiwanese and Chinese copies, the arrows actually go through an evolution. When you're looking at the Barnett, the knock end is flat. The original Chinese arrows are flat also. And then recently they've evolved to having a grooved knock so the string can set in it. So if you look close, you can see that. But the grooved arrows of Taiwanese and Chinese manufacturer will still work on a flat knock and vice versa. Now, the most recent evolutions are carbon arrows. And we'll get into the cost of all these and how we would use our crossbow in SHTF. Now, the first lesson is disregard everybody that says that arrows are reusable, because that all stems from them shooting at soft, recoverable targets during recreational and competition shooting. If you shoot at actual animals or you're doing combat shooting and you hit the ground, you hit hard stuff, you're going to lose most of the arrows you shoot. Now, whether that's a temporary loss and the arrow is rebuildable, that's debatable. Because if you look at these, you can see these hit something hard, and these shafts, people would say, are unrecoverable. Now, I could take this and use a conduit bender and straighten it enough that I could use this as a bombardment arrow for indirect fire, but not as a direct fire arrow at a specific target. The same thing here. This one was bent only at the end, so it is repairable. Now, most of the time when you're firing these arrows and you're doing indirect fire or direct fire, you're going to destroy the fletching. And if you look at these have all been re-glued. And if you have the equipment to do this, then it can become a reusable arrow. So in order to reuse an arrow, you have to be able to recover it, which may be impossible in SHTF. The second thing is you have to be able to remanufacture and repair it if it's repairable, which means it won't be available for immediate use. So when we're looking at a crossbow, you really need to have a lot of arrows. So I would look at having a minimum of 100 arrows for a crossbow. Now what we'll do is look at the logistics and cost of that. So when we're looking at crossbows, they have 3 useful ranges. So the capability of the weapon can be broke into 3 different range groups. So from 0 to 40 yards, it can be a point target weapon where you're shooting accurately at an individual target. Then what would happen is you have 40 yards to 150 yards where you can address point areas. Now, a point area are small groups of people, a battle line, a mob, a riot, a group of people. And then the crossbow and the bow and arrow can be used as indirect fire weapon, firing at high angle from 150 yards to between 400 and 600 yards, depending on the poundage, the weight of the arrows, and the manufacturer of the crossbow. Now, in the 80s and 90s, I did a lot of experiments where I did high angle fire, and I used an M15 grenade launcher sight attached to various crossbows so that I could precisely adjust the angle of fire. In that way, you could accurately predict how far your crossbow bolts would go. So in SHTF, because of the low rate of fire, I would rather have a .22 rifle that had 18 rounds of ammo in a tube magazine than a crossbow, because the amount of firepower I could generate with a .22 and the amount of opportunities to actually hit the target is so much more than you have with a crossbow or a bow and arrow. The firearm is the better way to go. Now, the crossbow and bow and arrow are quiet, so they can be used in a stealth capacity. If you're shooting against animals, it still remains relatively quiet. If you're firing it against humans and they get hit and they scream, you're going to lose any advantage of quietness. So the average person is not going to be able to hit somebody precisely enough to prevent them from yelling when firing a crossbow in SHTF. Now, the real use of this is indirect fire, because if you're protecting a position, a compound, a village, a small town, a position, there's dead space that you can't address with your firearms because you don't have any indirect fire capacity. So if there's ditches, there's valleys, you can shoot over top of buildings with crossbows, things like that. So that's where it really shines. And if you practice and you get a grenade launcher sight or a protractor and build a grenade launcher sight, you can pretty accurately drop arrows. Now, one way to think about this is if you worked your way up on an enemy camp at night, 10 archers could drop quite a few arrows in a camp on sleeping people and guards without ever being detected or heard. So the stealth capacity along with indirect fire is where it's really at with crossbows and bow and arrows. Now, unlike TV, putting a rain of arrows down is not going to happen unless you have a lot of arrows. So for instance, if you watch that movie Kingdom of Heaven and you look at the siege of Jerusalem, you see 10 to 20,000 arrows going out at one time. You can't afford that, and I'm going to show you why. So when we look at crossbow bolts, what I did is I priced 1 dozen arrows along with the broadhead. So for a 16-inch bolt, that came to $43.99 for 12 arrows. For an 18-inch arrow, it was $44.99, and for a 20-inch arrow, it was $44.99. These are low cost and low quality Taiwanese and Chinese components. So the $16 broadheads are in the middle of the low cost range. They go from $13 up to $20. And that's for 12 cheap broadheads. Same thing with arrows. So when you add in the sales tax you got to pay to get this stuff, this is your new number, because the government is going to take 7 or 8% of your survival capacity in taxes right off the bat. So what that does is gives us a cost per arrow with a broadhead. So you can see that roughly if you're using low-cost arrows in either a Barnett, a Taiwanese, or a Chinese crossbow, it's going to be $4 per shot. So if you don't recover your arrows, it's going to be $4 a shot. Now, what I did is I gave us a round number. If we get 12 dozen arrows with broadheads, which is 144, that brings us up to $564.84 to $577.68. So you can see 144 bolts is $500. So you're actually paying twice as much for crossbow bolts. In arrows, for bow and arrows, are slightly higher than this at the low range. So you could buy 2 rounds of 308 or 3 rounds of 5.56 for what you're paying for 1 arrow. Now, when we're looking at bombardment arrows where we're engaging area targets with indirect fire, the Chinese and Taiwanese components are the only affordable way to do it. Because if we look at hunting crossbows, a medium quality hunting bolt without any broadhead, 6 of them cost $50. So when you look at it, just the arrow is $8.33. 144 of them would be $1,199.76. And I'm going to tell you right off that hunting broadheads that are high quality are hideously expensive. So $1,200 is just the cost of a medium quality bolt. This is a Barnett 16-inch bolt. When we come down here, that works out to $6.60 a bolt, $950.11 for 144. These are the shockers. This is an Excalibur Diablo 18-inch arrow, and each arrow without a broadhead is $10.67. So 144 of them would be $1,535.76. And then we have more examples of expensive arrows. This is a top of the line Excalibur Pro Flight. These arrows are $28.33 a piece, so it would cost you $4,079.52 for 144 of them. So you can see your only real choice in SHTF, if you're going to use combat archery, is to buy the lower end Barnett and Chinese and Taiwanese crossbows along with a large amount of arrows. Now, I know that everybody's going to be crying on the internet, and they're going to want to say that they can make all their own arrows. So what I did is I looked at making arrows, and everybody on the internet, except for very few, are using machine tools, table saws, drills, and other electronic equipment to make these arrows. So what I did is to hand make one arrow. It would take you roughly 1 hour to make the broadhead, and that's from a tin can, for instance, a soup can or beer can. Making the shaft, cutting it, turning it, straightening it, 3 hours. Assembling the arrow, the broadhead, and the fletching, 3 hours. So what that's telling you is it's going to take 7 man-hours to make each arrow. So you're going to need somewhere around 100 people to make enough arrows to keep 2 or 3 archers in business. Now, if we make them from components, what I did is put $20 down for glue. Dowels, if you're using hardwood, it's $90 a hundred. If you're using bamboo dowels, it's roughly $78 for 100 of them. Then if you use duct tape for fletching, that's roughly $17. And then if we use scrap cans for broadheads and make our nocks also out of those scrap cans, that gives you an idea your material cost to make 100 arrows. But as I said again, that's the cheapest way to make an effective arrow, by hand. So what we find out here is utilizing archery is much more expensive than actually using firearms. So the reason we would actually want to use them is twofold. They may give us stealth capacity, and they may give us indirect fire capacity. And the last reason we want to use it is if we're under a human wave or a mass attack, we would want everybody shooting. So if we don't have enough guns to arm everybody, we would use bow and arrows, we would use crossbows, we would use combat darts like plombadas, we would use muzzle loaders. That way everybody is fighting. So please share your thoughts. We'll see you on the next video.